Hey, what's going on, guys? I figured that since Chroma Prime's out, it'd be a good time to go over Chroma's abilities and talk about a few of his builds. I haven't had a chance to farm my own Chroma Prime yet, but all the information in this video is going to apply to Chroma Prime as well. First I'll go over Chroma's abilities, then I'll talk about some builds for him, and then finally I'll end with some gameplay. And if you're here for a certain part of the video, check the description for timestamps. But let's start by talking about Chroma's passive, Elemental Alignment. This passive gives Chroma an elemental buff depending on its energy color. You can have cold, heat, electricity, and toxin. And depending on what element you've chosen, his abilities will function differently. But it's important to know how that works before going into the other abilities. And speaking of the others, I'm going to start out with Vex Armor because it's by far Chroma's best ability. And if you know anything about Chroma, you'll know that he has one of the best damage buffs in the game, and that's from Vex Armor. When you activate this ability, damage to his health and shields will increase both his damage and armor respectively. Both of these values are dependent on your ability strength, so the more ability strength you have, the bigger the buff is. Vex Armor is also applied in an AoE aura around Chroma, which is moddable by your ability range. Honestly, I don't really find myself using the range very much to support my teammates, but it could just be that I'm more of a selfish player. If you want to mod for range on your Chroma, you can, but personally I prefer going for more damage instead of range. And Vex Armor is recastable, which means you can refresh the duration by casting your third ability again. Being able to recast is very useful for maintaining Vex Armor throughout a mission. And if you're playing Chroma, you should probably be keeping Vex Armor up. To get the maximum value out of this buff, you need to receive at least 100 health damage and 400 shield damage. Because Vex Armor works this way, most people use some sort of self-damage mechanic to get their buff up to max instantly. This is more relevant in the Eidolons, but it's also very good to know for normal gameplay. My two preferred methods for this are a secondary with concealed explosives, and a thrown melee weapon modded for toxin damage. The toxin damage will bypass your shields, giving you your damage buff faster. All you need to do for the self-damage is to activate your Vex Armor, and then throw whatever you have chosen at your feet. So if you have a concealed explosive secondary, you throw that at your feet, or if you have a thrown melee, you then throw that at your feet. The two builds I have for this are the Haiku Prime, which when modded for concealed explosives, you don't need any extra damage, you just need multi-shot and fire rate. And that's all I have here. And my other personal favorite, the Cerata. The one thing I will say about the Cerata is that it's pure toxin damage, which means it's not going to damage your shields. Because of this, it won't trigger your armor buff. Although I find in normal gameplay it's not that much of an issue, considering most enemies will hit your shields and you'll get the buff up pretty quickly. But the two main mods here are Power Throw and Quick Return. That's what allows you to take self-damage. Now once you have the Vex Armor buff active is where it gets a little confusing. The damage buff you gain from Fury does not scale with plus damage mods like Serration or Heavy Caliber. This also extends to Riven, so if you have a plus damage on a Riven that isn't elemental, it won't scale with Vex Armor. This means if you're playing Chroma and you're modding for damage, you don't want to have plus damage mods on your weapons. I went over how this formula works in detail in my Chroma Eidolon Hunter video, and this is the formula that Vex Armor follows if you're curious. But for this video, I'm going to simplify it. So let's say you have an 800% damage multiplier on your Vex Armor. That's a times 8 multiplier. If you were to then use Serration and Heavy Caliber on a weapon you're using, the bonus from that would be added to your Vex Armor's calculation. So instead of an 800%, you would then get 800% plus 330% if both the mods are maxed, giving you an 11.3 times multiplier. This is then multiplied by your elemental damage mods. So for this example, let's just pretend we have a 200% elemental damage multiplier. When we multiply these two values together, we get a 22.6 times multiplier, which would be our damage multiplier in this scenario. Now instead of using Serration and Heavy Caliber, if we were to then mod for more elemental damage instead of plain damage, let's say we mod for an extra 200% elemental instead of the 330% plain damage. This multiplication then turns into 8 times 4, which means we get an overall 32 times multiplier, compared to the 22.6 that we had previously. So I hope that makes sense. The bigger your plain damage multiplier is, the more value you gain out of elemental damage. Which is why on our weapons with Vex Armor, we want to be modding for elemental damage over plain damage. It's a little confusing, but here I'll show my Lanka build for hunting the Eidolons, and you'll see I'm using elemental mods over plain damage mods. If you're playing Chroma and using his damage buff, which is basically the whole point of the frame, make sure you mod whatever weapons you're using for elemental damage. Alright, that was a bit of a long explanation, but I think it was important to understand. The armor buff works in a similar way, where you're going to get more armor out of having strength mods than you will running mods like Steel Fiber, although the armor is a lot less confusing to mod for. Basically, if you're running Intensify, you'll gain the same armor out of Intensify that you will Steel Fiber. The augment for Vex Armor, called Vexing Retaliation, gives you an AoE damage proc every time you take 150 points of damage against either your shields or your health. And just like Vex Armor, it has a different effect for both shields and health. For your shields, it's going to proc puncture damage, where for health it's going to proc blast damage. The range of this proc is affected by your ability range, and the augment basically just serves to increase your survivability. because the puncture proc is going to weaken the enemies, causing them to deal 30% less damage to you, and the blast proc is going to knock them on their asses. And while they're knocked down, they're not going to be able to hurt you. Overall, I'd say this augment really isn't very useful for giving you survivability, especially because Vex Armor gives you so much already. But if you want a little bit more, this augment is available to you. The second ability I want to talk about is Elemental Ward. This is another aura ability that changes depending on what Chroma's energy color is. So depending on your passive's elemental alignment, you'll either have a cold, heat, toxin, or electric aura. All these auras have the potential to deal damage to enemies, although overall the damage is pretty negligible, and I'm not going to be covering it in this video. If you want to know more about the damage, I would suggest checking the wiki. But for this, I'm going to focus on the other buffs that Elemental Ward provides. The two most beneficial buffs are the cold and the heat. The cold buff gives you bonus base armor depending on your ability strength. And even though this says base armor on the wiki, it doesn't look like it's going to combine with your Vex Armor buff according to this formula, but I'm not entirely sure about that. Either way, the bonus armor is still very good, but I'm a little unclear on how exactly it works. So if anybody knows for sure, please leave a comment below, because I'd love to know how it works for myself. Now the heat version of Elemental Ward gives you and your allies additional health. The electricity version of Elemental Ward gives you additional shields, but because shields are pretty bad for survivability, there's not a whole lot of uses for the electricity aura. And finally, the toxin version of Elemental Ward. This aura will give you and your allies additional reload speed and holster rate. It's just a really nice weapon handling aura. And you can use this for things like the Eidolons to help switch between weapons faster, or if you just like the bonus by itself. But overall for Elemental Ward, I'd really only recommend either the cold or the heat versions for most gameplay. And you're only able to have one of these buffs applied to you at a time. So even if you have two chromas in a game, you're only going to get one of them. As for the Augment Elemental Ward, it simply maintains the buff on your teammates even after they leave your range. This is basically a support augment for Chroma. And if you're running the Heat Elemental Ward, I'd really recommend running this augment, because there's a bug where if a teammate enters your aura and then leaves it, they'll be left with a big gap in their health bar. So if you're using Heat, you really want to be running Everlasting Ward. The next ability I'm going to talk about is Spectral Scream. This ability is complete garbage. What happens when you activate it is that Chroma breathes out whatever element you have currently equipped with Chroma's passive. This puts you in an unarmed state and counts as channeling, which means you won't gain energy from most sources. And you can't use any other weapon. And have I mentioned yet that the damage from it is garbage? Just complete garbage. I mean, if you want to pretend you're a dragon and kill like level 10s, then this is the ability for you. But for everything else, it's just pointless. The damage is affected by ability strength, and the range is affected by ability range, but there's no way to make it useful. I don't know a way to do it. And the augment for this ability, Afterburn, is equally as useless. It just shoots out a projectile when you deactivate Spectral Scream. And like Spectral Scream, its damage is really bad. Chroma's fourth ability, Effigy, is kind of in the same boat as Spectral Scream. It's just not useful, although the augment for it's kind of fun, which I'll show in a little bit. Just like with Spectral Scream, Effigy's element will change with your elemental alignment, and upon casting it, Chroma will gain 20 movement speed and lose 50% of his total armor. You're going to be losing half of your armor just to have an Effigy out, and the Effigy's attack range is 20 meters, which is kind of mediocre overall. And it also has a slam attack that is a 5 meter range, which again is very small, especially since it's just going to sit there unless you have the augment, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But I know I'm going to get a comment about using the Effigy to farm credits, which if you didn't know, the Effigy is going to boost your credit gains in a 10 meter radius while it's active, in addition to causing enemies to drop more credits. Please God, don't farm credits like this. Just play the index, it's so much better. It's so much better. I can't even say how much better it is, it's that much better. Just don't use your Effigy to farm credits. There are much better ways. The augment for this ability is hilarious. I wouldn't really say it's practical, because I don't really know use for it, but it lets you ragdoll enemies like crazy with Chroma's Effigy. What you do is you hold down Effigy to mark a target, and then the Effigy will seek out and attack that target, causing it and all the allies around it to be ragdolled like crazy. Other than this being hilarious to use, I don't really know use for it. And if you're going to use an augment on Chroma, I'd probably just use Everlasting Ward instead. But that's going to do it for Chroma's abilities. I know that was a lot, so I'm hoping at least you guys learned something from it, because understanding how Chroma's abilities scale can be very beneficial when building your own. But now that I've gone over the abilities, let's take a look at how I built Chroma. I have two basic builds for Chroma. One is just for general gameplay, and the other is for the Eidolons. For my regular gameplay build, I've just gone for duration, efficiency, and strength. And I'm not going crazy high into any of them. This build's all about just maintaining Vex Armor and Elemental Ward throughout a mission. I'm not particularly concerned with having a crazy damage buff here, because even with a moderate 220% strength, I'm still getting a 600% damage buff from Fury, which for non-boss enemies is more than enough. And all I really care about here is maintaining my buffs. So to accomplish that, I'm running some duration with Prime Continuity, Narrow-Minded, and Constitution, with ability efficiency from Fleeting Expertise. This does drain my duration, but I found the reduced ability cost more important here. You could swap this out for a regular Streamline if you want to keep more duration, but like I said, I didn't really find it too necessary for me. And for most normal circumstances, you really want to have good efficiency on Chroma, because at base, the Vex Armor costs 50 energy, so striking a balance between your efficiency and your duration is kind of important for maintaining it. And maintaining Vex Armor in addition to Elemental Ward can be very costly. And then as for my ability strength here, I have Intensify, Augur Secrets, Transient Fortitude, and Power Drift. The reason I'm not running Blind Rage here is again because I want to maintain my ability efficiency. And running Blind Rage is very costly in that regard. I'd much rather sacrifice my duration with Transient Fortitude. And of course I have Vitality for survivability. And then finally, as for my aura, I have a Dash Polarity, just to run Corrosive Projection. But you could swap this out for another aura if you wanted to. Like Energy Siphon, maybe Growing Power if you want to switch your polarity. It's up to you. And then as for my arcanes here, I just have Arcane Grace and Arcane Energize. But you can really use whatever you want. I just like these because they help me survive easier. And I realize that not everybody's going to have either of these. But your arcane choice is really just up to you. The next build I want to look at is my Eidolon Hunting build. For this build, I've gone for much higher power strength, less efficiency, and higher duration. And that's simply because I want to get the most damage out of it without recasting it constantly. The extra energy cost here isn't too much of an issue because, like I said, I'm not casting very often, and I'm also going to be using a lot of energy pads during the Eidolon hunt. If you're hunting Eidolons, you really want to be using energy pads because they're going to save you a whole lot of trouble, especially when you're trying to min-max your builds for damage like this. And like I mentioned, I have a whole video that goes over this build, so I'm not going to talk about all the individual mods. And I'll link to that video above if you want to learn more about hunting Eidolons with Chroma. The only minor change between that video and this is that I'm using Handspring here, which I find quite useful on Chroma to make sure you're not knocked down for extended periods of time. And of course I have 2 Arcane Nullifiers here to give me 100% magnetic resistance. And then I'll also show you guys a quick support build that I threw together, although I haven't really tested this, so don't take it too seriously. But this does give you a whole lot of range on Vex Armor, allowing you to buff your teammates very easily. And it runs Everlasting Ward, which means that your teammates are never going to drop your Elemental Ward buff. But as you'll notice, all of my Chroma builds revolve around using his Vex Armor and Elemental Ward. There's just not a huge benefit to building around Effigy or Spectral Scream, and that's just because the abilities are horribly underpowered. Hopefully now that a lot more people are going to be playing Chroma, we'll get some sort of rework around it. And if that happens, then I'll make a new video. But as Chroma is currently, this is how I like building him. The 2 main ways I like playing Chroma are either for the Eidolon hunts, or typically for like an assassination sortie, or just, high level enemies. Because normally you won't really need the high damage buff. And honestly, after they changed how Vex Armor's armor buff works, the survivability isn't amazing. It's not bad, it's just not as crazy as it used to be. Because you used to take basically no damage at all, and now you have to actually work to survive. But overall, I think making Chroma a little squishier wasn't the worst thing in the world. So for hunting Eidolons, I only have a 847% damage multiplier. You can definitely get higher than this if you're using other things like the Umbral mods, but for this build I'm not using them. And for hunting Eidolons, you really want a solid team around you to be able to one-shot the Eidolon limbs. And a big part of that is stripping down the armor, which again I have another video for that I can link above. I have much better in-depth Eidolon videos than this, and this is just to show off some basic gameplay without going too in-depth. Which is why if you want to know more about this build particularly, I'd suggest watching some of the other videos. As for my normal gameplay build, it's going to give you enough damage and survivability to take care of most content up to sortie level. I definitely prefer using the Cold Elemental Ward. It gives you overall more survivability than the Heat Aura, although that's partially because I'm not running any armor mods on my Chroma itself. So I get a whole lot of value out of my increased armor for my power strength here. If you were to run more armor mods, it might be more beneficial to run the Heat Aura, and especially if you're running with a squad, depending on what frames they have, running the Heat Aura can be more beneficial to their overall survivability. It's really just going to depend on what kind of situation you're in. But like I mentioned, if you're going to run Heat, make sure you're running the Augment Everlasting Ward. But overall, Chroma is a pretty great frame for both survivability and damage, although its first and fourth abilities leave a lot to be desired, and I'm really hoping with the increased popularity after Chroma Prime comes out, we're going to get a rework because it's desperately needed. And maybe they'll change the Vex Armor formula to make sense to new players, because you shouldn't need a video like this to explain how a damage calculation works, and it's horribly misleading for a newer player just starting to play Chroma. But that's going to do it for me today, guys. If you found the video helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you leave a like, and if you're looking for more content like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button. But that's it for me. Hope you all have a good one, and I'll see you later.